In the year 897, a pope stood up in court to prosecute a defendant who had been dead for 9 months. That defendant was also a pope. His decomposing body was dug out of its grave, dressed in full papal robes, and propped up on a throne to answer for crimes he had allegedly committed while he was still breathing. A living cleric stood beside the corpse to answer questions on its behalf, because, understandably, the corpse itself had absolutely nothing to say. Historians now call this the Cadaver Synod, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the strangest events in the entire recorded history of the Catholic Church. This actually happened, in Rome, with bishops present and minutes taken. And the truly unbelievable part is not even the trial itself. It is what happened to the man who staged it, only a few months later, in a plot twist he absolutely did not see coming. To understand how you get here, you first need to understand 9th century Rome, which was less a spiritual capital and more a knife fight that happened to wear a mitre. The papacy was not simply a religious office. It carried land, taxes, armies of allies, and the power to legitimize kings, which made it a political prize fought over by rival Italian noble families the way modern parties fight over a swing state, except the losing side sometimes ended up dead rather than merely disappointed. The man at the center of this particular fight was Pope Formosus, who took the papal throne in 891 after a genuinely impressive career as a bishop, papal legate, and diplomat across half of Europe. He was, by most contemporary accounts, competent, well-traveled, multilingual, and reasonably well-liked by ordinary Romans. He had also, decades earlier, already survived one excommunication and been reinstated, which should have been his first clue that Roman Church politics never really let go of a grudge. None of that experience, or that resilience, would end up saving him. Formosus inherited a mess he did not create but could not avoid. Years earlier, the powerful Duke of Spoleto, Guy III, had muscled his way into being crowned Holy Roman Emperor, and had then pressured the Pope at the time into naming his young son Lambert as co-emperor as well, locking in Spoletan control of Italy for a generation. Formosus was stuck confirming an arrangement he neither liked nor trusted, ruling in the shadow of a family with more soldiers than he had. So he did what any 9th century power broker in a weak position would do, he looked for a bigger friend. Formosus quietly opened a back channel to Arnulf of Carinthia, a rival king north of the Alps with a real army and no love for the Spoletans, and essentially invited him to march into Italy and take the imperial crown for himself instead. It was a genuinely dangerous letter to send. If it had been intercepted, it likely would have ended Formosus's papacy immediately. It was not intercepted. Arnulf accepted the invitation, marched south through the Alpine passes, took Rome, and in February of 896, Formosus personally crowned him emperor in St. Peter's. It was a bold move, and for about 2 weeks, it looked like it had worked perfectly. It was also about to get very awkward, very quickly. Here is the problem. Almost immediately after his coronation, Arnulf suffered a sudden stroke, or something the sources describe as a paralysis, that left him unable to lead his own army. He had no choice but to retreat back north across the Alps to recover, taking his soldiers, and with them Formosus's only real protection, back home with him. Rome was suddenly wide open again, and the Spoletan faction that Formosus had spent years quietly trying to outmaneuver came flooding straight back into the power vacuum, this time furious and looking for payback. Formosus himself did not live to see how that played out. He died in April of 896, barely 2 months after crowning his chosen emperor, most likely of a stroke of his own, worn down by years of exactly this kind of pressure. He was buried in St. Peter's Basilica with what was, at the time, a completely ordinary and dignified papal funeral, full vestments, full honors, a stone tomb. Nobody standing in that basilica that day had any reason to expect the sequel, let alone the one that was coming. The papacy first passed to a man named Boniface VI, who lasted about 15 days before dying, reportedly of gout, though 15 days is a suspiciously short reign even by the standards of this chaotic era. Next up was Stephen VI, and this is exactly where things turn. Stephen owed his entire position to the resurgent Spoletan faction, the very same family Formosus had spent his whole papacy quietly trying to sideline in favor of Arnulf. And with Arnulf gone, sidelined by illness, and unable to protect Formosus's legacy from beyond the grave, Stephen suddenly had both the motive and the muscle to settle a score that technically belonged to his patrons more than to him personally. His solution was not a strongly worded letter, a quiet excommunication, or even a formal condemnation delivered to an empty grave. It was, by every surviving account we have, something closer to full political theater with a body count of exactly one, except that one body was, notably, already a body. In January of 897, roughly 9 months after Formosus had been laid to rest, Stephen gave the order, dig him back up. 9 months underground in a stone tomb is long enough that this was not some fresh, camera-ready cadaver preserved for a dramatic reveal. This was a genuinely decayed, actively decomposing body that had to be physically hauled out of its tomb by attendants who presumably did not volunteer for the job, dressed once more in the full, elaborate ceremonial vestments of a reigning pope, and then carried by procession into the Grand Basilica of St. John Lateran, Rome's actual cathedral, to face the one court appearance no defendant in recorded history has ever attended less voluntarily. The corpse was seated upright on the papal throne itself, propped in position, dressed in full regalia, in front of an assembled synod of bishops. Since a 9-month-old body cannot, obviously, speak, answer questions, or mount any kind of legal defense, Stephen appointed a young deacon to stand directly beside it and answer every charge on the corpse's behalf, in the first person, as though he personally were Formosus. Picture the actual scene for a second. A packed basilica full of bishops and senior clergy in their finest robes, the overpowering smell that must have filled that hall, and one visibly terrified junior deacon improvising legal answers into a corpse's silence, live, in front of the entire Roman clergy, while trying very hard not to be sick. This is not a lurid rumor invented later by chroniclers trying to make the church look bad after the fact. Multiple independent contemporary sources describe it happening essentially exactly like this, which is part of why historians still argue about it today, not whether it happened, but only exactly how staged each individual detail really was. The formal charges themselves were almost bureaucratic, which somehow makes the whole spectacle worse rather than better. Formosus was accused of perjury, of illegally acceding to the papacy in the first place, and of improperly holding more than one bishopric simultaneously, technical church law violations, read out loud to a rotting body propped up like a puppet in front of an audience. Unsurprisingly, given that the presiding judge, the driving accuser, and the entire political motive all belonged to the exact same Spoletan faction, the corpse was found guilty on every single count. Formosus's entire papacy was then retroactively declared null and void, which meant, practically speaking, that every ordination and appointment he had ever made while alive suddenly became legally invalid too, an administrative and theological headache that would genuinely haunt the church for years afterward. Then it got physical. Stephen had 3 fingers hacked off the corpse's right hand, specifically the fingers a pope uses to give blessings, stripped the body of its papal vestments right back off again, and had what remained thrown unceremoniously into the Tiber River, presumably intended as a final, humiliating erasure. You might reasonably expect Stephen to have walked away from all this looking powerful and unchallenged. He did not even close. Word of the trial spread through Rome almost immediately, and the public reaction was not fear or approval, it was open disgust. According to several accounts, a monk quietly recovered Formosus's mutilated body from the river not long afterward and hid it away, at real personal risk. Legends quickly grew up around the corpse too, including claims that religious statues around Rome bowed toward it as it was carried past, and that the river itself had somehow refused to fully swallow it. Historians today treat those specific miraculous details as later pious embellishment rather than sober historical fact, but the embellishment itself tells you everything you need to know about the public mood in the city at the time. Ordinary Romans had very quickly, very firmly decided that Stephen, not the dead Formosus, was the actual villain of this story. That public mood did not stay quiet for long, it turned into an actual uprising within a matter of months. Stephen was seized by his political opponents, forcibly stripped of his papal office, and thrown into prison, where, in the summer of 897, he was strangled to death by unknown hands. The man who had ordered a corpse dug up and prosecuted for crimes it could not possibly answer for lasted barely half a year longer than his victim's exhumed body had spent above ground. If you were hoping for some kind of tidy, almost poetic justice out of the 9th century, this is about as close as real history is ever going to get you. It still was not over, though, not by a long way. Later that same year, Pope Theodore II convened a new synod that formally annulled the entire verdict of the Cadaver Synod, publicly rehabilitated Formosus's name and reputation, and had his recovered, battered body reburied in St. Peter's Basilica with full papal honors, dressed once again in proper vestments, this time for good. But here is the part that almost nobody brings up when they tell this story. The underlying political factions behind this entire fight were nowhere near finished with each other. Formosus was actually put on a posthumous trial again a few years later, under Pope Sergius III, who reopened the whole question and reaffirmed the original guilty verdict a second time, for purely political reasons of his own. It ultimately took the Catholic Church until the year 904 for this specific fight to be considered settled for good, and the entire ordeal eventually helped push canon law toward an obvious but apparently very necessary new rule: you cannot legally put a dead man on trial. No pope has attempted a repeat performance since, which, given everything you just heard, feels like an unusually low bar to be proud of clearing. Here is the part that rarely makes it into the shorter versions of this story. The Cadaver Synod was not some isolated freak event, it was closer to the opening scene of a much longer chaotic saga that historians later nicknamed the Saeculum Obscurum, Latin for the Dark Age, roughly 60 years running from 904 into the 960s, during which the papacy was effectively controlled from behind the scenes by one powerful Roman family. A noblewoman named Theodora, and later her daughter Marozia, held enough influence over Rome's politics that contemporary chroniclers accused them of installing and removing popes almost like pieces on a board. Popes were deposed, imprisoned, and in at least one well-documented case, quietly murdered on Marozia's orders. It is a genuinely wild stretch of church history that most people have simply never heard of, and it all traces back to one very bad idea, that a political grudge could be settled by putting a corpse on trial. So the next time somebody tells you that medieval history is boring, tell them about the year an actual corpse got an actual court date, lost, had its fingers removed as part of the sentence, and ended up dumped in a river, only for the man who prosecuted it to be strangled to death himself just months later for the trouble. That is not a legend, not a spooky campfire story, and not a Dark Ages rumor exaggerated over time. It is on the historical record, described independently by multiple contemporaries, debated by historians for over 1,000 years, and it happened inside the actual institution that still exists today. If stories like this are exactly what you come here for, follow along, because true history keeps turning out stranger than almost anything anyone could make up.